Welcome back, friends and patriots. This is episode 17 of Lippincott Talk. I am your host, Josiah Lippincott. Today's question is this: why hasn't the closure of the Strait of Hormuz resulted in an economic catastrophe for the West? This is a surprise for many. Pre-war, the Strait of Hormuz carried 20% of the world's oil traffic. It has been functionally closed for months now, more than 100 days due to fighting. And yet, the American economy is great. We've seen a massive bull run in the stock market. We're near or at all-time highs nearly every week for 2 months in a row. The price of oil spiked to about $117 a barrel and then fell back down. Today, it closed around $92 a barrel. So pre-war, $67, it spiked, but then it's in collapse already, and the Strait's not even open. The war isn't even over. So how do we make sense of all this? One of the common narratives is that the global economy is hanging by a thread, right? Their supply chains are brittle, right? We're vulnerable to just-in-time production. You could lose one critical resource or mineral, and we're at the behest of China or some other power because of just how much deindustrialization has wrecked the American economy. And this pessimistic narrative is everywhere, and it's dominant in driving policy right now. You see a lot of talk about manufacturing and industrialization. But what I will say is that in observing the Hormuz non-crisis, seeing how complacent markets have been, to see how much growth there's been in spite of this geopolitical event closing down a major critical waterway. In light of all that, I have come to reanalyze my own understanding of markets. And I want to share with you some of the things that I've learned and some possible explanations for why it is the case that these supposed crises often turn out to be really hollow. And a lot of this has to do, well, it all has to do with how the market really works in practice. It turns out consistently, markets, producers and consumers are far more efficient and far better at optimizing than the pessimists give them credit for. And this truth is crucially important to understand when thinking about geopolitics and foreign policy. It is simply the case, and I'm going to argue this today, that there are no critical resources in the modern world. There are no crucial waterways. The United States national defense does not depend on any one material or any one supply chain in some foreign country. And it is just the case that the high-tech, hyper-modern, interconnected global economy is very resilient. In fact, the American economy has never been more resilient than it is right now to foreign supply disruptions. And the real lesson coming out of COVID, and highlighted in the Russia-Ukraine war and the economic ripple effects from that conflict, and then now in the Iran war, the Strait of Hormuz crisis or non-crisis, I think, what we're seeing out of all of this is the United States economy is very, very resilient. It is very resilient. That does not mean there will never again be a recession. It doesn't mean stocks will go up forever. It doesn't mean there can't be problems. And I'll talk about some of the reasons we could see problems. But the point I want to hammer in this show right now is that buying into these pessimistic narratives is not helpful, and they often turn out to be incorrect. And that's just a crucial data point to understanding the world around us. And I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian here from the normal contrarian take and argue that the finance bros and the market, stocks go up, green line go up people actually have an edge on the pessimists. And they're describing a real phenomenon. And it doesn't mean, again, there is no cause for pessimism. It just means you have to understand how things work. And you have to know facts. This is crucial. I've learned this myself, and the work that I've done has meant changing my mind. The Strait of Hormuz, this kerfuffle, if you will, has been educational for me. I've learned something. And I suppose it's possible at this point that at any day, the release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve or commercial stocks could cause the price of oil to spike. And I will say, initially, I feared that very much could happen. And there were people who were laughing off the whole thing from the beginning, and I was cautious, and I thought, I think this is hubristic. But I'm just looking at the data, and increasingly it's just like, where is the crisis? Where is the supply shock that was supposed to send gas to $8-9 a gallon? It hasn't manifested. I mean, prices are elevated pre-war, okay, right? But they're falling. I mean, gas prices here in Michigan were nearly $5, $4.99 a gallon a couple of weeks ago for just normal unleaded, and now it's 362. 367, somewhere in that range right now. So the price is already down about $1.30 from the peak. And this increasingly does not look like an accident. And I think for me, as someone who's not a day trader and I don't have any financial stake in any sort of product here, other than, I invest in index funds. I don't pretend to be a high-powered genius. I'm not an insider trader. I don't have, inner workings of the oil market, etc. I come at these problems as a generalist. I come at them as from a fundamentally political perspective. I come as a student. I come as someone who wants to understand my country. But again, I just want to be clear. My analysis here is political. It's not about financial products. Maybe some of you can take this and turn it into money. Wonderful. I hope so. But the real goal here is just to understand, to be honest, to tell the truth, right? I'm not trying to grind a propaganda axe here today. And I'll be blunt with you. I do not think the war in Iran is a good idea. I oppose it. I think the starvation blockade of Iran, we've shut down their major port at Bandar Abbas. I've seen some speculation, warranted speculation, that Iranian imports and exports are down 98%. This includes the bulk of their feedstock for meat production, so animal feed. And then I think they're probably also suffering from just food shortages in general. Some of this, what I've seen is they're experiencing week over week 25% inflation, week over week, right? The value of meat in Iran has apparently gone up by about 700% since the beginning of the war. So increasingly, it looks like the Iranian people are in a bad way. And if this keeps going, it could get horrific. Human beings are very resilient. It takes fewer calories per day to survive than you may think, actually. But it doesn't mean it's going to be good. And from my perspective, imposing immiserating conditions on 93 million people over nuclear weapons that Iran does not have, right, is not right. It doesn't have anything to do with our national security. I don't think Iran threatens us at all. And in fact, the analysis I'm doing here just shows they can't even threaten the world economy. And it's not clear they're going to be able to in the future. I think the Iranian regime believes they have more leverage than they really do. And that seems to be increasingly just a fact. Could be wrong about that, of course. I always have to stay humble, fam, as it is. And, if I'm wrong, then I'll learn something there too. But so far, it just seems clear that Iran really doesn't have the ability to resist, blockade and strikes from abroad. They have more firepower than many of America's recent opponents. They've done real damage to our bases in the Middle East. They have killed Americans. On the other hand, they've taken their lumps, and they've been hit hard by airstrikes, missile strikes, and then by this starvation blockade. So I think, it's difficult, and we're living through the event right now, so it's hard to make sense of these things as the data comes in, but we have to do it anyway. You have to make an attempt, and you have to state your thesis clearly so you can see, was I right or was I wrong? And right now, what I'm seeing is global markets are just really efficient, and they have absorbed the vast bulk of the disruption much more easily than I expected initially, and I think much more easily than the Iranians expected. One of the striking things about justifications for the Iran war is if Iran has a nuclear weapon, it could hold the Strait of Hormuz hostage. So in order to prevent that from happening, we need to attack them now in the spring of 26 before they have a nuclear weapon. So, and then thereby closing down the Strait of Hormuz so that Iran can't use nuclear weapon to close the Strait of Hormuz in the future. Okay, I don't think that logic is very sound. Again, I think Iran is too weak to threaten the United States. Nuclear weapons are vastly overrated. The radicalism of the Iranian regime is overrated. They're much more pragmatic than Western, analysts typically state. The Israelis just outright lie about this, and the neocons do as well. In reality, Iran and Israel have been longtime partners, often covertly. And I'm talking about after the Islamic Revolution. Again, things in the Middle East are very complex, and apparent opponents often can find ways to work together, and that has happened between Israel and Iran before. There's a lot of wish casting that goes on by observers. So someone will say, I oppose the war in Iran, and therefore, because the war was launched, the American economy has to suffer. So the war is immoral, therefore bad things need to happen or will happen to the United States because we did an immoral thing. The problem with that logic is the consequences of any given decision are often not quite so clear, and the chain of causation is long. And just because, something bad happened, it may have negative effects. It just may not have the negative effects you expect. Or they could look a lot different and take a lot longer to manifest than you realize. I think there's a very powerful argument to be made, for instance, that the American involvement in Lebanon in 1983, in conjunction with the Israeli invasion, there's a very powerful argument to be made that that intervention by Ronald Reagan was the source of the anger at American foreign policy that manifested in the 9/11 strikes by al-Qaeda. That at least was the argument that Osama bin Laden made in 2004. So the point is, most Americans have no idea we intervened in Lebanon in the 1980s. Of those Americans who do know, what percentage would connect that to our later involvement in the Middle East or the 9/11 strikes? Not very many, right? But oftentimes there is a chain of causation. You think you're doing one thing, whatever Reagan thought he was doing in Lebanon at the time, stabilizing the Middle East, Cold War, 4D chess, whatever was going on, trust the plan during the Cold War nonsense. The reality was it had follow-on effects that no one at the time predicted. And that's just the reality in human affairs. And it's an argument for restraint, of avoiding thinking you know more than you do and making decisions that can have follow-on effects that you don't want. It's an argument for prudence and restraint, and it's often ignored. But again, involvement in Lebanon in 1982 or 1983 did not result in economic catastrophe for the United States. Markets rose throughout the 1980s. Americans were buying cars and clothes and occupied with thinking about, summer vacation and the ordinary facts of life. And they weren't thinking about foreign policy. They weren't thinking that potentially in the future, jaded and disillusioned and angry Middle Eastern men would see these events in Lebanon, get angry at the United States, and then fly planes into buildings. That wasn't a thought that Americans were having while the economy was booming in the 1980s and 1990s. But in reality, there's things going on behind the scenes. So my point is simply this. The chains of causation are long, and you need to avoid wish casting or imagining that just because you have a preferred outcome or have a moral view, that means, therefore, either bad things will happen or good things will happen, depending on how you view a certain event. For instance, if you're a neocon watching this and you think invading Iran is awesome, you need to be able to admit that there will be consequences that aren't great. There will be Americans who are killed. There will be money that will be spent. And instead of pretending that everything that flows from your preferred course of action will turn out well, you need to admit that there are real costs or there are real trade-offs involved in these decisions. And that's the argument for honesty that we need right now. When it comes to the present, crisis or kerfuffle or conflict or war or whatever you want to call it that's going on in the Middle East, the ceasefire where we shoot at each other, it is simply the case from what I've seen so far that the market is very, very efficient. And economic catastrophe from this event is low. And that's what the market is saying right now. There's good reason to believe the market is pricing it incorrectly. And just the reality is we live in an economy that is extremely technologically advanced. We have a lot of computer resources. There are global shipping companies. There are producers. There's capital. There's money. There's knowledge. There's AI now. You have all these different tools available in the present market to adjust to a supply shock. And the market is very, very good at doing this. And there's a reason, and I think now, in the 1970s, the supply shock in oil led to basically 20 or 30 year, it's about 25 years of really higher inflation adjusted oil prices. And they peaked in the Iranian revolution in 1979. But then they fell throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and we're at a low right before 9/11. But the point is, that was a different set of events. So just because there was a supply shock then in the 1970s doesn't mean that a supply shock now would have the same effect. There's just a whole new set of economic data that's relevant to political and economic life. And you can't just copy paste past events in order to understand why things are happening now. You have to look at the driving forces and factors that are transhistorical, that are always present. And it's from those axioms that you can get your bearings on thinking about things that are happening in the world around you. So the truth that was present in 1973 and that's present now and has always been present is that human beings seek the good, right? They seek happiness or good things and avoid misery or bad things, broadly understood. That is always true. And the reality is the human beings and Americans have gathered up a lot more good things and a lot more tools. So we have a lot more consumer goods now, and we have a lot more capital goods. And the distinction there is a consumer good is a present good for a present end. So you can use it right now for a satisfaction of a want. But a tool or a capital good is a present means for a future good, right? You have to wait, but it gives more in the future than you can get in the present without that tool. And so that's why we have capital goods. They're a means by which we can acquire more of what we want in the future by deferring consumption today. But the point is, America is a lot more wealthy than it was 50 years ago. And that has real consequences. So even though the Strait of Hormuz crisis right now, I've seen estimates say about 10 million barrels of oil production are offline per day since the war began. So well more than 1 billion barrels of oil have just gone off of the world market since the beginning of the war. And you'd think that sounds like a lot of oil, and it is. But the reality is the 10% loss in oil is a loss among the least valued barrels. And this is something called the law of marginal utility, and I'll state it here. The marginal utility of a unit of any good diminishes as its supply increases. What that means is the more of a good thing that you have, the more of a good that you have, each additional unit of the good that you acquire is used to satisfy a less needed want. And the point is, human beings order their scale of desires and seek to satisfy the highest desire they have with the resources available in the most efficient way possible. So, the first 10 million barrels of oil is really valuable. It's used for the most important things that we can use oil for. So if the world only had 10 million barrels of oil, those barrels of oil would be very, very valuable. I mean, it's impossible to know what the number is, but it would be very high. You could easily see if the world lost 90 million barrels of oil tomorrow, a barrel of oil in price could rise to maybe $1,000 per barrel. Could be something that high, that crazy. And the reason is because there are really important uses for oil that you just can't have human life without. And in a market, if you reduce supply, then there are those who still have demand for that good at a higher price and are willing to pay it. And so what happens as you add supply or as you lose it is, as you add supply, the barrels become less valuable. They're serving less important wants as you go down the list. So the last barrel of oil, the 100 millionth barrel of oil pre-war was being used for, plastic toy production or as an input into production of certain kinds of inks or something. It's not very valuable. It isn't like you need it to eat every single day or to keep the lights on so people in hospitals don't die. The last barrel of oil is being used for things on the lowest of the collective ranking of the needs of oil by humanity. And so when you lose oil, you're losing the least desired uses of oil first. And so the price signal that you get from the reduction in supply wipes out those marginal producers. because they're not that valuable. And as soon as the price rises a little bit, consumers stop buying that product. They reallocate all of their resources. That's why it is the case, or can be the case, that supply shocks are not nearly as debilitating as the pessimists make them out to be. And there's another dimension in all of this, which is the loss of these resources. The consumer immediately reorients all of his desires to account for the increased price. There's a reallocation of resources that happens immediately. So yes, price on gasoline rises, people reduce consumption. But another thing happens. Producers make more of the good because they can make more money off of making that good at that price. They know that there would be demand if the price were lower, so that means they can produce more and expect to make money. So the effect of high prices is immediate. It immediately has an effect on behavior of human beings. And that reallocation process is very efficient. And the more human beings and the more computers, the more producers, the more consumers, the more information in the economy, the faster that process of reallocation can take. It can be done, within fiber optic cables that are carrying, each small gradation in price is spreading throughout the economy. So there's a pattern that emerges here, which is you get a supply shock. And this holds for any commodity. You get a supply shock, and it's immediately followed by a price hike. So there's a reduction in supply, there's a spike in the price, because now people want that good, and they're willing to give up a lot to get it. Their desires they want to fulfill, and there's not as much as there used to be. So they have to forego something else in order to get what they want. So that's what a price rise is. Every price is just a ratio, right? It's a ratio of money to a given commodity or good. And that means if there's less of the good, then there's more money that can chase after those goods, and that means the price rises. It's just a ratio. When that happens, producers and consumers both adjust. When the price goes up, producers will make more of that good, and consumers will optimize their usage. They'll reduce it as much as they can and reallocate their resources appropriately. When this happens, eventually you get a glut after you've had a shortage. So people use less of the good, more of it gets made at the high price. Eventually you get a flood of the good onto the market, and you get a restoration of equilibrium. Usually, and oftentimes at a price lower than the one that existed before the supply shock or the crisis. This cycle of shortage, there's a shortage of a good, the price spikes, then there's adjustment in behavior, then there's a glut, there's an overage of the production of that good, then the price falls. That cycle occurs in the free market all the time. You can see this, for instance, in egg prices. Last year in March, a dozen eggs cost $6.25 on average in the United States. Today, a dozen eggs costs $2.25 a dozen on average in the United States. And you can find them here in Michigan. I think the price is under $1.50 at the local Meijer. Well, what happened? Well, for one, there was a supply shock. The Biden administration ordered a bunch of chickens to be killed because there was some bird flu going around. The price spikes, it goes way up. Then producers have an incentive to make more eggs, and consumers have an incentive to stop using as many eggs. So there's an adjustment in consumer and producer behavior. In response, the price then falls off a cliff. Right? I think you're going to see this happen with beef prices. They've been super high and skyrocketing since October of last year. You just see the price goes up. And I'm telling you right now, very soon you're going to see the total collapse. You'll see consumers will really pull back on beef. They'll eat more chicken. They'll eat more pork. And in turn, beef prices are going to fall. And I think they're going to fall dramatically. By next year, I would not be surprised to see beef prices fall in half. Right? That's a very common, that pattern holds in commodities over and over and over again. When you don't see that price hold, when you don't see that pattern hold, it tells you that the government is doing something to that commodity, right? It's intervening in a way that's preventing the market cycle from taking place. That you can see a good example of a commodity that does not go through the cycle of supply shock, shortage, and then glut, and price fall is homes. Homes are just rise and rise and rise. And after 2020, they spiked and they've remained relatively flat in price for the last 5 or 6 years. And that is the case because of government policy, zoning restrictions. The government subsidizes home loans by essentially insuring home mortgage payments to banks. So even if you default, the banks are not on the hook for that money. So the federal government created a 30-year mortgage. It subsidizes people getting that mortgage. You can see zoning restrictions that make it hard to build in markets where there's a high demand for housing. You also see welfare payments. So that Section 8 housing, those kinds of subsidies in a constrained market, rent control is another example, those subsidies in a constrained market make it so that people who would otherwise have to buy much lower quality housing can bid up prices, and that bids everything up across the market. Another example is inflation. When you increase the money supply, it causes the cost of assets to go up. And then you also have crime. So when you have high crime areas, it's very difficult for people to want to move there. And again, so all of these factors combine to artificially keep the price of the housing high. Housing really is a consumer good. It's not really a capital good. It's a consumer good. It's just one that takes a long time to wear out. But the point is, we Americans tend to think of it as a capital good because of artificial constraints. And in reality, housing prices should be falling. They should be low. They should be way lower than they are now. Housing should be just cheap. And there's no reason for it not to be except for these regulations. So the purpose of saying all this is to, draw attention to the working of the market, the working of human behavior is very important for understanding geopolitical events. When you start looking at the market as a whole, the reality is the United States is not very susceptible at all to supply shocks. Even if you saw supply shocks in computer chips or rare earth minerals, which actually aren't that rare, by the way, in the end, it wouldn't really matter because the market would adjust. In every single case, when you see a huge price spike, the result is always then adjustment of consumer behavior and then the price falling. And so I think the United States now is we're not very vulnerable. We're not. And you could still have a recession because of malinvestment created by inflation. That is a very real possibility. I'm not going to dismiss that. But the truth is, that's a self-inflicted wound. It isn't inflicted on us abroad by a foreign power. I think it is very much the case that policymakers drastically and dramatically overrate the influence and power of China, for instance. Russia is the same way. If you look at the Russia-Ukraine war, you've had 1 million killed in that war. Perhaps, depends on which numbers you believe. Hundreds of thousands of dead at least, millions of casualties, and the reality is the global economy kept growing. Yeah, you had a little bit of a shock in the energy markets in 2022, and then it recovered. The truth is, supply shocks they're not that important. The markets are really good at pricing in disruptions to supply. And they're really good at pricing in increases in demand. All of those things are part of the normal market operations, by which I just mean human beings voluntarily working together, fixing problems, trying to secure their good are really, really efficient. And they're getting more efficient over time. So that means the pessimist case is getting weaker as time goes on. Economically, right? Politically, there are other problems that need to be dealt with, right? We've got communists here, we've got socialists, we have crime is out of control in a lot of different places in America. You have immigration fraying at the civic values that make possible the free and prosperous economy. All of those things are real, but those are political problems that deal with the nature of law, consent, governance, violence. The world of exchange is a different world, and that world is very efficient and getting better all the time. And it really is the case that the market is growing in strength, and you see the state apparatus draws down on that wealth. It is able to remove what was productively created and reallocate it to the ends of those who control the state. And that's a conversation that's worth having and delving deeper into how that works. But my point here today is just to say, I want to really caution those who are pessimists in the economy. You have to adjust expectations based off of data. And it may be the case in the end that the market bears, the pessimists will have a day of it and will have their moment in the sun. But it will be only a moment because the long-term trend is very, very positive. It's very, very optimal, right? There's a lot of good things that are happening. Economic recovery happens way faster than people recognize. And the less the government does to intervene in that process, the faster it goes. So there are real problems. We need to address them. We need to be concerned with them. But again, I want to give a note of caution for those who just overrate American vulnerability. That is not a good bet to take, in my view. And I used to think we were more vulnerable than we really are. And it's worth pondering what that means for the question of justice in our own time. And I think that'll be something I'll get into in a future show. But hopefully that's been helpful for today. I want to remind you all to follow me on X at @JLippincott. You can follow me on Substack at Regime Critic. You can also listen to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Again, I am your host, Josiah Lippincott. This has been another episode of Lippincott Talk. I hope it has served you well. I hope you've learned something. I want to thank you for listening.